And I just think the more that we understand what food means in our culture, when we understand our food system, the rituals that we have around food, why we come together. And, if we're just, like me, a curious person with an appetite, I think that it's just a way for us to really just connect.
Welcome to the Bountifull Podcast, where we explore what it means to live a bountiful life. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Adrian Miller, an acclaimed food writer, James Beard Award winner, attorney, and certified barbecue judge. Adrian is an expert in African American culinary history, and his work delves deep into the rich traditions of soul food, barbecue, and often overlooked contributions of African American chefs throughout history. From serving as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton in racial reconciliation efforts to his roles in government and community leadership, Adrian's journey has been as diverse as it has been impactful. In this episode, we'll explore the intersection of food, culture, and identity, how culinary traditions shape our understanding of history, and how food can be a source of joy, resilience, and connection. Adrian, welcome to the Bountifull Podcast.
Thank you. So good to be with you.
You've done a lot. I like it. It's a good vibe.
Yeah, I got a lot of spare time on my hands.
Doesn't sound like it. So we're here in Denver, Colorado today. Are you from here? How long have you been here? Tell me a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah, so when I normally tell people about my upbringing, it loses me all street credibility on the subject of soul food. But I was born and raised in the Denver, Colorado area, the metro area. So born in Denver. Then when I was young, my family moved to one of the suburbs, predominantly white suburb. So grew up there, and then I went to Stanford University undergrad. Then I went to Georgetown Law School. Came back and practiced law for a few years, but I hated it. Not to disparage any of your viewers and listeners who have attorneys in their family or they are attorneys, but it just wasn't for me.
Recovering lawyers are a common thing.
Yes, more than they should be. So I got a chance to work in the Clinton White House. I worked on something called the President's Initiative for One America. It was a racial reconciliation effort, which was really, really cool. But at that time of my life, I've always wanted to be in politics. So after my stint in the Clinton White House, I came back to Denver, was in a think tank job for about 6 years. And think tank is a place where they create policy, and then the idea is to pitch it to policymakers and have it hopefully implemented into law. So I worked for a progressive think tank here called the Bell Policy Center. And then I ended up working for Colorado Governor Bill Ritter Jr., and then he decided not to run again for office. And so then I transitioned and I wrote this book on the history of soul food, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then my current job, after I finished that, I moved to my current job, which is I'm the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches, which is all about bringing churches together and they get to know each other. And then the idea is that we build on those relationships to do social justice work.
What was it about, Stanford and Georgetown are quite prestigious universities. What was it about the law to start there? Why did you want to study that?
Well, because I always believed that the law was an agent for change. And in a country that is typically ruled by law, if you want meaningful change, you can have political movements, you can have you can have all kinds of things happen. But in order for it to have staying power, typically you have to have it enshrined in law somehow. So I wanted to study the law and then figure out how to make law a tool for social justice. And so that's how I always thought about it.
And then a lot of what we're kind of bumping up against in the podcast or in season 1 is sort of twofold. One is like how impact starts at an individual level and around contribution. And if you kind of take care of yourself in your immediate sphere, then that will take care of the world. And then the second thing is kind of like the systems and structures that we live in. And if you want to live a bountiful life, how you have to almost function within those systems and structures, which kind of sounds similar to we do live in a, law society. How do we change the structure in order to, get the desired outcomes that we want, the lives that we want?
Exactly. And so it seems to me that you should be familiar with how that machinery works in order to change it, reform it, make it better.
Yeah.
So that's why I studied law. It was really that aim, like how can we have more social justice in our country through law?
Have to ask, why did you not end up liking the law? What was it about it?
I decided to basically go work in a law firm only because when I came out of law school, I had so much debt that I couldn't go work for the government or do what we call public interest law, where and that's the stuff that really sinks to my soul. So I took what we call golden handcuffs, because when you go work for a law firm, you make a lot more money. So typically in the U.S., when you go work for a law firm, you make your desire known. It's what type of law you'd like to do, but they just kind of figure out where they want to place you. So I was doing litigation and employment law when I really wanted to do corporate law, because I wanted to do what we call deal making and bring people together. And I wanted to help entrepreneurs start their businesses and grow to their exit strategy. I figured that's kind of cool.
Yep.
But I never got to do that.
Well, it's like additive rather than subtractive.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it just got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office. And just to show you how rough law firm life is, when I would start singing, white people would join in.
Yeah.
So I'm just kidding. That's a joke. But anyway, it was just soul crushing. So I wanted to do something else.
Oh, I love that. Great joke too. I appreciated it. How did you end up in the whole Clinton, I don't know, administration or doing stuff there? Because that sounds like a very important project and also something pretty special to be a part of.
Right. So it's the typical I knew somebody story. So I was, wallowing in my law practice in Denver, and then I got a call from somebody who I went to law school with at Georgetown, and she was already in the White House working for this initiative, and they wanted to do a quick hire. So she was just calling me to say, hey, do you have anybody you can highly recommend so we can do this quick hire? And I said, well, tell me about the initiative. Didn't say that quite yet, but I was intrigued. And I said, tell me about the initiative. And so she was working on something called the Initiative for One America, which was an outgrowth of President Clinton's initiative on race. And here's the outrageous idea behind the initiative on race. Okay, you ready for this?
I'm ready.
If we just talked to one another and listened, we might realize that we have a lot more in common than what supposedly divides us. I know, outrageous, right? So that initiative went on for 2 years, and the people running that said, okay, we need to have an ongoing office in the White House to deal with this. And they named that the Initiative for One America. So my friend was on that. And so after she told me this, I did the same thing that Dick Cheney did when George W. Bush asked him to help find a vice president. Right? I was the head of the search committee. My name was the only one put on the list. So I went to D.C. So I was at the very end of President Clinton's second term. So I was there for about, 16 months. And so it was cool. We didn't have a lot of resources. And so a lot of what we did was highlighting the work that people were doing around the country, and then also using President Clinton's persuasive power to, push people to really support diversity initiatives and figure out ways to bring us together.
What were some of the things you learned during that time?
Well, despite what we hear in the news, there are a lot of people trying to bring us together. You always hear about the forces that are tearing us apart. And in terms of people that are bringing us together, it might be an interesting local public interest story, but you don't really hear about these folks on the national level. So just to see all of these folks who are doing this work was really cool. And then I realized how hard it is. There's just a lot of fear. There's ignorance. People have a reluctance to be in a space where they might be the bad person. So, coming into a space to have a dialogue is a challenge. And a lot of it is just trying to create that space so that people will come into it. Now, the thing I haven't figured out yet is, how do you get that person who does not think about these tough things or doesn't want to think about these tough things? How do you get them into a space to talk about these things? But if you can get them in that space and everybody has a measure of goodwill and they're willing to say, okay, despite whatever you say, I am just going to hold that tension and love you as a human being and just try to learn from you, because we're going to keep talking. We're going to try to figure this out.
Yeah.
And then understand that you may not figure it out, but there's something good about that journey of being with someone else, especially if they have a different perspective, a different background, and just understanding how they see the world. But that takes something, right? Because you have to come into that space and say, okay, I'm not right about everything. For some people, that's extremely difficult.
Or I don't know everything, or I don't know what I don't know. Like, please help me understand.
Right.
Yeah.
For some people, it's really difficult.
The world is definitely, I sort of feel like, I've said this a few times, but it might not be the right way to say it, but I sort of feel like there's less if I see someone different from me, I'm just so much more curious to be like, hey, tell me about you, because I love to learn. And I am sort of a bit of a fan, if possible. I know it can be incredibly hard because obviously some of the issues we are dealing with in the world are really, really complex and challenging. You put the issue on the table and you sort of like float around the table and hear all the different viewpoints, and then like usually you should learn something, right?
Right. I'm gonna put a different perspective on it. I think we are naturally curious, but somehow it gets like worked out of us. Because like look at kids. Kids are curious. They ask questions, they want to explore stuff, and then we just like get rid of that somehow.
So I guess we know a little bit about your upbringing. Tell me about your background in terms of like how you arrived at writing your 3 incredible books and kind of transitioning out of being a lawyer into and sort of in that think tank era and then into being a historian.
Well, the short answer is unemployment. So I had just finished my stint in the Clinton White House, and at that time in my life, I actually wanted to be one of the senators representing Colorado. So I was trying to get back to Colorado and start my political career. But at that point, the internet bubble had burst, and so the job market was really slow. So I was watching a lot of daytime television. I'm really embarrassed to tell you what shows.
Like Days of Our Lives or something?
Jerry. So you know that show,
Some
right?
like Judge Judy or something?
No, Jerry Springer. Yeah, it was bad. All kinds of shows. So in the depth of my depravity, I said, I should read something. So I went to a local bookstore, and while I was in that bookstore, I'd always liked to cook. And I saw this book on the history of Southern food, written by a guy named John Edgerton. It was called Southern Food at Home, on the Road, in History. So I said, I'm just used to cookbooks. I've never really read a history of Southern food or any kind of history of food. So I bought the book, took it home, loved it. And then there was this one sentence early in the book that changed my life. And it said, the comprehensive tribute to Black achievement in American cookery has yet to be written. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Now, the book was written in the late 80s. I'm reading it in 2001. So all this time had passed. So I thought, well, somebody's done that. And so I tracked the author down on the internet, and I just asked him, I said, you wrote this sentence. Do you still think this is true? And he said, for the most part, nobody's taken on the full story. There's always room for another voice, so why not yours? So with no qualifications at all, except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking it some, that's what started the journey. So I did get a political job in Denver, came back, and then I was just like an amateur grad student. So after work and on the weekends, I went to my local public library and I got everything I could on African-American food traditions. So this is the work that I did. I read 3,500 oral histories of formerly enslaved people and just looked for all references for food, created an outline. I read 500 cookbooks, half of them authored by African-Americans because I wanted to put Black food traditions in a larger culinary context. Read thousands of newspaper and magazine articles. A lot of these are word searchable because they've been digitized. Talked to hundreds of people about Black food traditions, what they think they are, were, will be. And then because I care about my subject so much, I decided to eat my way through the country. So I went to 150 soul food restaurants in 35 cities in 15 states.
Hey, that beats my podcast trip.
So so that's all the work that I put in. And from that work, that led to all of my books.
What was your, so you mentioned that you grew up in a primarily white neighborhood in Denver. What was your own connection to your own culture and heritage and identity at that point in time? So
I'm very grateful to my parents for a lot of things, but one thing I really love is they still raised us in a Black household with Black traditions. And really importantly, they kept us connected to the Black church in inner city Denver that we were going to before we moved out there. So we made that, and it seems like a long trek now, but it was only like a half hour. But still, it seemed like a long trek. And so I was connected to Black culture in that way. And because, they eat, and some families have done this. They could have gone to the suburbs and say, you know what, we're just gonna pivot and live differently and try to connect more with the people around us. But they didn't do that. So I'm very grateful for that.
You go on this tour, you're like, I'm gonna write these books or this book. What is your why, and how did you know that you could do it? Was a spiritual answer, or did you just really want to encapsulate this time? And
so, there's just a time in your life when something happens and you just know that you're the person to do this. And so it was something, because it was singing to my soul, and it was something that I was curious about. And also the fact that nobody had really done it. So one of the common threads for me is that I'm about forging new paths, creating my own traditions. And so the fact that so I really dig it when somebody's never done something before. That's what I love. And nobody had really ever done a serious treatment of soul food because it was mostly cookbooks. And then soul food didn't have a great reputation outside the Black community. And it's got a troubled one within the Black community. But I just kept seeing all these other cuisines being celebrated. And I was like, well, why not my food? And so the other thing, I did get some validation, not a lot, but some, because I would tell people what I'm doing, and some people would light up in response to that. Now, a lot of people thought, you're crazy. Why would you do that? You went to Stanford, why would you waste your education on this? So I knew I was onto something. Now, it was quite a financial investment. And so I made some of the worst financial decisions in my life pursuing this dream. But in terms of my own happiness, the most rewarding decisions.
Let's talk a little bit about the books, and then I can ask you some other questions. So you went on this journey, you've got 3 books. So let's start maybe with the first one, Soul Food. And I'm going to read a little blurb.
Okay.
So Soul Food, the surprising story of an American cuisine, one plate at a time, written in 2013 or published then. So in Soul Food, Miller delves into the rich history of soul food, tracing its origins from West Africa through the transatlantic slave trade, the American South, and the Great Migration. He provides in-depth analysis of iconic dishes, explaining their cultural significance and historical context. He emphasizes that soul food is a cuisine born out of necessity and resilience. It arose from enslaved people's resourcefulness and ability to create flavorful, nourishing dishes from often meager ingredients. So tell me a little bit about that and what you found.
Yeah, so growing up, you just hear that soul food is this delicious thing. Often it's a story of triumph because it says, okay, we had the worst stuff thrown at us, the stuff that white people would not eat, that they considered garbage, and then we made it delicious. So that's kind of how I grew up thinking about soul food. But once I started this journey and started looking close, taking a closer look, I realized it was much more complex. So when I talk about soul food, I say it's the bringing together of the culinary ingredients and traditions of West Africa, Western Europe, and the indigenous people here in the Americas. All of that coming together in the American South. And I started to see the complexity of it and how when you look at enslaved Africans throughout the Americas, the way that their food is very different depending on obviously the physical environment, but the indigenous people with whom they interacted and also the European enslavers. So that mix and how, because like the British operated slavery different than the Spanish and the French. Yeah. And so depending on that had a really significant effect on food autonomy. And so what I tell people is that soul food is really a British meal with West African influences. But when you start going further south to the Caribbean and South America, which in terms of climate is more similar to West Africa, it's more of an African meal with European influences. And so I'm fascinated by kind of those culinary connections and interactions. So so it was really interesting just to take a closer look. The biggest surprise, though, is that I found that soul food, even though it was presented to me as a story of primarily race, soul food's really more about class and place. Because if you look at the way people ate in the American South for centuries, it really was people of the same socioeconomic class in a place where eating very similarly. It's only because of race that they didn't eat together. And so that was eye-opening to me. Because I was like, oh, well, that complicated the whole story of soul food.
Is there an example of like people over here are eating meat and potatoes and people over here are eating meat and potatoes, but it's like...
Well, I think the classic example is chitlins, which are chitterlings. Do you know what chitterlings are? Okay. So it's a British term for entrails. So it's the guts of an animal. Okay. So usually pigs, but it's a generic term, could be anything. So there's this whole thing, like chitlins was the emblematic example of how Black people took something that white people did not want at all and made it delicious. Now, there's mixed opinions on whether chitlins are delicious, even in the Black community. It's not for everybody. But I found numerous examples of white people eating chitlins and relishing them. In fact, to this day, in late August, so right around this time, there is a annual chitlin festival in Sally, South Carolina.
Of course there is.
Started by white people in the early 70s and maintained by white people. Thousands of people come to this thing. Now, I have on good information that you can smell the festival at about the 50-mile marker as you're driving towards it. So, so that complicates it, right? Because if white people like chitlins, then this whole narrative of chitlins as the throwaway food that only black people could eat, that's not true. Not completely true. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the story, but it's not completely true. So it's just things like that I started seeing.
And so you called it the surprising story. Was that the main surprise, or were there a few other surprises?
A lot more surprises. So again, growing up in this country, you don't really get a sense of the ties to Africa. You learn a little bit about slavery, but that's pretty much it. So it was interesting to see all of the things in Southern food that come from West Africa, like okra, black-eyed peas, watermelon, sorghum.
I love all those things.
Yeah. So all of these things come from West Africa. And then you start to see dishes that weren't necessarily from West Africa, but you could see it was an adaptation. Like, for instance, greens. There's a type of green that is several types of greens that are beloved in West Africa, but because of the difference in climate, they wouldn't thrive here. So you see enslaved cooks substituting the bitter greens of Europe. Collards, kale, turnip greens, mustard greens, cabbage. So to see those adaptations happen too. Gumbo, a lot of people like to say gumbo is a reinterpretation of bouillabaisse, the French stew, but it's definitely an okra stew from West Africa, because okra, gumbo, in a lot of West African languages, the word for okra is similar to gumbo. And so you start to see these reinterpretations and adaptations, and so it just really changes your perspective on these things. It moves it away from Europe to West Africa. And so that is something that I just didn't know.
Why do you think this matters? Like, what is the lesson that we can all take out of, like, this book, do you think?
Well, I think it matters because it shows connection and it shows interaction and interplay. So, we get this kind of version of history that is siloed, and we really downplay the amount of interaction that has happened. But I think the soul food story is important because, first of all, it shows the contributions of indigenous people and how much colonists and even enslaved Africans relied on them to figure out how to, get food from the local environment and how to prepare it, and how to be nourished from it. We see the interaction with Europe, we see Africa, and you start to see how people are interacting and learning from each other, adapting from each other. And I think, even though in very tragic circumstances we see this interaction, slavery, near genocide of indigenous people, but I still think there's lessons that we can learn today, that there are ways that we can come together. And maybe if we were just to look at our past and see the ways we collaborated in the past, that could set a foundation for collaboration now. And hopefully, I think, lead us to a shared future.
I have always been I guess, not a fan, but a believer that I sort of think of food as a gift. And the gift is that, say, if I like cooking and you like connection, I give you my food and we connect over that. And then it's sort of like the communion of people, which then shared ideas and or shared experiences come from. And then, the what we were talking about earlier around that whole, we might have difference of opinions, or we might have different backgrounds, upbringings, ideologies, but coming together around food and then being able to, as you termed it, like break cornbread together is special.
Yeah. And cooking's an act of love, right? When somebody cooks for you, they're saying that they care about your survival, right? That they want you to be around. I mean, even if the food is nasty, still the act of cooking is meaningful. And so I think we've forgotten some of these things. And I think we just need to be reminded.
Are we, with the convenience fast food generation, are we deviating from connection? And like, I don't know, could you extrapolate and say that like part of the reason why the world is so lonely is because we sort of lack these like coming together big meals when we're sharing and connecting, and we're not on our devices or ordering from a robot?
Right. Yeah. So I think we've definitely diminished connection in many ways, but we can still make up for it even if we get all our food in all these different ways, if we still manage to come together. And in a way, social media is kind of mediating that, because even though we're not ordering the food together, there's still this space where you can come together and talk about these things. So you can talk about Nashville hot chicken with somebody who lives in Europe because somebody opened a place over there. And so that's a level of connection that we have never really had before in such a fast way. So I think it's complex. I think, unfortunately, though, most of the forces, the modern forces we have at play right now, are leading us to isolation. But there are some that are still trying to connect us. And I think it's just, if we think of things like social media and other things as kind of these neutral tools, I think part of it is we can probably use these tools in a way to bring us together.
Yeah. Okay, so before we get to the next book, I'm going to ask you some other questions. Given your background, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but what role do you think that culture and identity plays in living a bountiful life?
So to me, living a bountiful life means that, to use a phrase from Joseph Campbell, the famed kind of folklorist and guy who's examined mythology, is finding your bliss. And I think, to use a common term these days, is about being your authentic self. So I think the challenge for us now is we don't always have these things sorted out. Like, do we always know what our culture is in a full sense? We may have gotten shorthand versions of it. And so I think part of education and self-discovery is to find out these things about yourself, asking questions of your parents and other people in your culture, just like, hey, why do we do this? Like, why do we eat this food on this day? And what is that supposed to mean? And if they don't know the answer, because often the meaning of these things have been lost because we haven't passed them down, going out and finding books to get those answers. And then identity, that's always, I think, something we're searching for. We may have a full sense, but not the fullest sense of who we are. So I think it's just a continual thing. I just believe that food can help us with that, because typically when we are eating a dish, especially a traditional dish, we're being connected to ancestors, but we may not fully appreciate why that's happening. And so that gives us an opportunity to discover more.
How do you see the world?
In very complex ways. So my thing is, my vision for the world is, I would love to see a world where we're more collaborative in addressing the problems and challenges that we have in this world. Because we have a lot of serious challenges: climate change, wealth inequality, war, all kinds of stuff. And I'm not naive to think that we could have a perfect world, but I think we could make the world a lot better. That we don't have the problems that we have don't have to be so intense. And so I look at the world as a collection of interesting people. And sometimes we're in conflict, but I think there are more people in the world who are actually about collaboration and getting together. I think the unfortunate thing is that it tends to be the people who have power who are more interested in conflict. And that leads to a lot of the problems that we have now.
Do you have any words of wisdom or thoughts around, at an individual contributor level, what are things that we can do personally that lead towards a more collaborative world?
So to use a food metaphor that I've been using a lot, because actually in my faith world, I actually preach a sermon about this, but I've talked about this in other segments. I think we at the individual level need to start setting a welcome table for other people in our lives, especially people who are very different from who we are.
What is a welcome table?
So welcome table, it's a metaphor. You see it in theology and other things, but it's this idea that the welcome table is a place where you can come. There's no respecter of persons. Everyone is welcome. And when you sit at a table, you recognize everybody's humanity. And so it's this space where you can come and just, learn, maybe work some things out. And one of the things that is a real challenge right now, as I mentioned earlier, is just getting people to that table. But there are fewer spaces in our society left where people of different walks of life come together. Sports, to some extent, church, and the table's one of them.
How do you see yourself?
I see myself as what I call a reconciliation entrepreneur. So I see myself as a fundamentally nice guy, not perfect, who's just trying to figure out ways to bring us together. And a lot of my journey has been like, what is the best way for me to do that? And part of this is just my foundation as a person of faith. So I'm Christian, and so I actually focus on the things that Jesus actually said, like loving each other, not all this other stuff that people are caught up on. And so by focusing on those things, I'm always looking for opportunities to bring us together. And to understand you could be of a completely different background, different faith tradition, whatever. I'm still going to love you. But I want to create some kind of baseline where we have mutual respect and kindness towards each other.
I must be on the path. You're already telling me your jokes.
Yes.
What advice would you give your 25-year-old self?
Go for the food stuff, or just follow your creative impulses. Because I knew, even at 25, even though at that time I was, lawyer at a corporate law firm, I knew that I wanted to do something creative and that I was stifling my creative side. But it was a failure of imagination. I just didn't know what I could do. And part of that is because I was never exposed to other things. So I would definitely say, pursue your creative side.
Okay, let's take a look at another one of your books. So here I have The President's Kitchen Cabinet, the story of the African Americans who have fed our first families from the Washingtons to the Obamas, published in 2017. And the blurb on it that I made up. The President's Kitchen Cabinet offers a detailed look at the African American chefs and culinary workers who have been essential to the White House for centuries. Miller showcases the important contributions these individuals have made to the food traditions of the nation's highest office, often whilst facing significant challenges such as discrimination, lack of recognition, and difficult working conditions. One of the key insights from this book is the idea that food is not only a means of sustenance, but also a form of influence and power. These African-American chefs were shaping the meals served to presidents, thereby influencing the food culture of the nation at the highest level. Despite being marginalized in many other aspects of life, they were able to find purpose and pride in their work using food as a way to express their identity and skills. Tell me about this one.
So this is the first collective biography of African-American presidential chefs. As I mentioned, I like to do things that haven't been done before.
Yeah.
So this came out of my research on soul food because I just found a few stories of African Americans who had cooked for our presidents. Definitely not enough to anchor a book. And so after I finished the soul food book, I said, let me just see what I can find. And I identified 150 people who have cooked for our presidents. And I'm just scratching the surface because for a lot of these cooks, records were not well kept. So every president of the United States, from George Washington to Joe Biden, has had an African American cooking for them in some capacity. And so with this book, I really kind of tell their story. I talk about the enslaved chefs, because we had several slaveholding presidents. I talk about the free people, the people that cooked when the president traveled, or when the president would go someplace and just stay for a while. I talked about drinks. The White House butlers were the ones who usually made the drinks. On Air Force One, all of those things. So it was just a lot of fun to tell that story and shine a light on these cooks, because it's they significantly contributed to presidential food, and they had a really important job because being president is a hugely stressful job, and so their idea, their role was to nourish and bring comfort to these first families. Yeah. And in some cases, they gave our first families a window on Black life in the United States. Now, not every president chose to open that window, but I think for the ones who did and took action, our nation has been better for it.
Yeah, I like that. So I guess the theme here is like influence and power. So are you sort of saying in the book, or is one of the things you found that the loudest voice, or if you don't have a voice or a seat at the table, you can influence in different ways. Like, how does that manifest?
Yeah. So, sometimes, and again, it just depends on the person in power, but they may be curious about, the person serving them food, their life. Like, what's their life like outside of, this place of work, which is the White House. And so you see examples of presidents actually talking to their staff, asking about their families.
Shocking.
Yeah. Because there were several presidents that, servants should be not seen or heard, right? Except unless I'm communicating something directly that deals with serving me.
In this book, there was also a theme of, purpose, pride, which we kind of talked about, persistence. But then also a theme of like contributing to something larger than themselves. So if you are an African-American chef cooking for a president, what did you find in terms of their contribution to the wider, I guess, community of African-Americans?
I think the main thing is that they were nourishing these presidents on what we would now call African-American cuisine. And part of that is because we've had so many Southerners as presidents. But over time, there's this culinary rivalry that develops internationally where French chefs, especially, men, are held as the standard for everything culinary. But the American response was, well, no, we've got the African-American chef, mainly Black women, as the counterpoint. And in many cases, people would say, yeah, we prefer the homey dishes of these African Americans compared to what you were doing. And so when you get to the kind of the early 20th century, you actually have African American cooks traveling abroad, making food to give people a taste of this food that they've heard about. So that was an interesting rivalry. But I think the main thing is just the exposure. Because of racism, African American professional opportunities were very limited. And so culinary was one of the few where a Black person could go in that field and excel without white resentment. Without a lot of it, I should say, because there's always white resentment when there's Black progress, unfortunately. So the fact that there was a forum where these African Americans could do their thing and excel and make newspaper headlines, not all the time, but every once in a while, I think that exposure, and there was a pride in that presidents really wanted Black cooks.
Even the difference, like there's a subtlety in the language, right? French people are chefs, Black people are cooks. Like, is that how they, do they view themselves as a cook or a chef, or is a chef like a white term, or?
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. So for a long time, chef just meant anybody who was in charge of the kitchen. So it was really not until the 1970s, at least in this country, that chef gets this implication of training and other things, because chefs wanted to just kind of control access to that title and, limit who could benefit economically from that. So this is really only in the 1970s that chef takes on the meaning that we think of today, because before it was just a generic term. And so I think if we look at history through that modern lens, I think most of these African Americans would call themselves cooks because they never really got formal training in the sense that they went to this school to learn all of these things. Typically, they were apprenticing under somebody. And again, for a long time, that's how you became a chef. So these notions of this terminology kind of has a mixed sense over time. But again, to answer your question, I think because of the food they were making, they would call themselves cooks rather than chefs. And I think that actually is a disservice to the culinary skill that they brought to their cooking. We've kind of created this artificial boundary that I don't know if it should exist as much.
Kind of goes back to the structures and systems, right? That are kind of we operate within.
And just to muddy the waters just a little bit more.
Perfect.
So what you find if you go back through history is that a lot of slave owners would actually have their enslaved African American cooks apprentice under a French chef so that they could make that French food. So Thomas Jefferson is one of the best examples with his enslaved cook named James Hemings, who for 3 years he had him train under various French chefs. But when he comes to cook for Jefferson after that training, he's called the chef de cuisine.
So can we look at soul food's legacy? So soul food has deep roots in African American history. How do you see soul food evolving today, and how do you balance honouring its legacy while adapting modern tastes and lifestyles?
Yeah, so soul food is definitely in a very, I think to use the current term, deconstructed place. Well, there's this very trend. So you have the traditional soul food, and then there have
Do you want
been.
to give us some examples?
Yeah, so I can just tell you just the typical the way that I wrote the soul food books. I created a representative soul food meal, and I write a chapter about every part of the meal, and I explain what it is, how it gets on the soul food plate, and what it means for the culture. And then there's recipes, traditional, health conscious, and then fancy ones in case you want to show off as a cook. So the meal that I created was fried chicken, catfish, and then chitlins, which we've talked about, greens, black-eyed peas, candied yams, which are a type of sweet potato. They're not tropical yams. Macaroni and cheese.
I did not know macaroni cheese was soul food.
Yes, as universal as it is, I can just tell you there are elderly African Americans who believe that Black people invented macaroni and cheese, which is absolutely not the case. But that just shows you how deeply loved it is in the culture. And then I wrote a chapter on cornbread, hot sauce, and red colored drinks have special meaning in soul food culture. And then because I could not settle on one dessert, I wrote about 4: pound cake, peach cobbler, banana pudding, and sweet potato pie. So that's a typical meal. So, and you can add smothered pork chops. There's all kinds of stuff you could add to that, but that's a typical meal. So we have these different trends now. So one is often called down home healthy. And the idea there is to cut back on the fat, the sugar, and the salt mainly. So you're still making versions of these foods, but you're just not doing it in a way that you have the full effect on your health. And then
I did read somewhere that maybe it was in your book or something, that some of the people that you talked to kind of said that soul food was a contributor to, death in the community because of like how high in fat and salt and sugar and these sorts of things were.
Yeah, there's definitely a group of people that believe soul food should have a warning label for all of these things. I disagree with that, mainly because soul food's the celebration food of the American South. And so anytime you eat celebration food on a regular basis, that's not going to be good for your body, So I just think people they're focusing on the celebration food aspect of soul food without looking at it in its entirety. Yeah. Because a lot of the things that nutritionists are telling us to eat, more dark leafy greens, more sweet potato.
More orange food.
Yeah, more fish. All of that is part of the soul food canon, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And then you've got vegan, which is actually the hottest trend in soul food. You're seeing a lot of creativity. And vegan is very close to how enslaved people were actually eating. Because if you go back and look, having access to meat, the glorious cakes and all that kind of stuff, that was not on a regular basis because those were prestigious. And so African Americans were not, human enough to really enjoy that stuff. They didn't have that status. And so they were pretty much eating seasonal vegetables. If they had meat, it was in very small quantities. It was not like the entrees that we think of today. So I just think that's as much as people think vegan soul food, that's an oxymoron. I actually think that's a homecoming. And it's also not too far off from how people are eating in Africa as well. Because in most places in the world, you're not consuming a lot of meat. It's really more plant-based.
Spent a little bit of time in Africa. I did a 350-mile bike ride through Zambia, and I can attest to this. And just a bounty of tomatoes. Mm-hmm. What grew there? So
yeah, which is interesting because tomatoes are native to South America. So that shows you the cultural introduction.
And like random tiny town back of the map, Zambia, where most tourists probably don't go. Town full of tomatoes, and they had this consensus where they're like, everyone has to have the same price so that we can all go home and feed our families.
Nice.
Which I actually really liked.
Yeah, that's a level of collaboration that's pretty cool. Imagine if that happened in other places in the world.
Well,
Yeah. And then the other trend that I see a lot now is fusion. And so you're seeing African-American cuisines mixing with other cuisines, Asian, Latine is what we say now, but Hispanic, Latino. So you're seeing a lot of that. And so I think that that's going to be going on for a while. There's a lot of cultural momentum for soul food in the South, so I don't see that really disappearing anytime soon. But I think these other iterations of soul food are certainly going to exist. I don't know of anybody who's doing molecular gastronomy with soul food. So there may be somebody doing a dish with colored green dust in sweet potato spheres, but I just haven't seen it.
We've talked a bit about how stories are lost, and I think this is true of nations, communities, families. Do you have any words of encouragement to people sitting here being like, oh, my family's pretty interesting. Maybe I need to document some of my stories or some of our recipes so that we can pass this down through the generations?
Yeah, do it. And just understand that it doesn't necessarily have to be a book. There's so many ways now to document it. Again, this is just a wonderful time to be a creative. So it may be just sitting down with one of your elders and just have a tape recorder going or a camera and just say, hey, yeah, tell me how you make that coconut cake or how you do this or that.
Yeah.
And it would be even more fun if you could record yourselves cooking together and maybe put that away someplace.
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't have to be a book. I mean, I'm partial to books because I like them because I think there's a little bit more permanence to a book. And I'm grateful that somebody 100 years ago took the time to write something down. Otherwise, that stuff would have been completely lost.
I have started writing down my recipes because I don't know, I'd call myself an intuitive cook where I kind of just like bang things together and it works out. I'm like, my mum has this, she calls it coconut ice recipe, where it's like a biscuit brownie base, pink marshmallow on top, but it's just so delicious, so fluffy, lasts in the fridge for, nearly a month. I have to have that recipe. She makes it for me every Christmas. I don't like gifts, but I'm like, you can give me 3 cases of that. Thank you very much.
Wait, did she willingly give up the recipe?
Oh, she will. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because there's a lot of cooks that don't want people to have their recipes.
Oh, I'm like, more the merrier, like just have it and you get joy from it too.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that are not on the same plane with that. In fact, if they won't give you the recipe, sometimes they do what was called a lesserpy. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, I can imagine.
So lesserpy is when they purposely leave out something that's critical to that, so you can't make it the exact same way.
So you're like trying to figure it out for you. That just sounds mean.
It is. It's spiteful.
Yeah. What do you think food teaches us about overcoming adversity?
Well, I just think if you look at the story of humanity, right? I mean, a lot of it was overcoming challenges in their environment in order to create a stable food source so they could survive. I mean, that's the inherent story of humanity, is the will to survive. And a lot of times that was manipulating the natural environment or being able to take something from the natural environment. We talk a lot about technology these days, but you look back and you think about how the ancients figured out certain stuff. It's pretty amazing. And I wish there was more documentation of kind of their thinking process as to when they decided to grow maize, to take this seed and then figure out a way to grow it in a way that the seeds would be bigger. And I just think that's fascinating stuff. So, but I just think that is the story of survival. And then how there was a necessity that we had to come together in groups in order to increase our chances of survival.
I mean, tribal culture back then was all about collaboration, right? Because if you didn't collaborate, you were dead.
Right. Yeah. And so we've kind of lost that.
I'd agree with that. This one is interesting for a few reasons we can get into in a minute. So the third book, Black Smoke, African Americans in the United States of Barbecue, published in 2021. In Black Smoke, Miller explores the overlooked contribution of African Americans in the barbecue tradition in the United States. The book traces the history of barbecue from its indigenous roots through its development as a distinctly American cuisine with African Americans at its heart. He argues that despite their central role in creating and sustaining barbecue culture, the African American pitmasters have often been erased from the narrative in favor of white celebrity chefs and food personalities. This book is a celebration of African American food traditions and the people who have preserved and innovated them over centuries. He tells the stories of legendary barbecue pitmasters, many of whom worked in obscurity, and highlights their creativity, skill, and contributions to American foodways.
Yeah, so this, again, came out of my soul food book, because originally in the soul food book, I was going to have a chapter on barbecue, because so many soul food restaurants have a barbecue option on the menu, and so many Black-run barbecue places have soul food side dishes. So the synergy, I just thought, but I kept finding so much stuff that I said, nah, this needs to have its own treatment. So if there's any representation of just Black contribution being severely diminished or even erased, it's barbecue in terms of the current storytelling. And as I point out in my book, I think barbecue is Native American, its foundation. Now, not everybody agrees with me, and they're wrong. But I think it's Native Americans' foundation, and then later colonizing Europeans and then enslaved Africans brought their own meat cooking traditions, and there's a collaboration that takes place, puts us on the road to what we now call Southern barbecue. But for 2.5 centuries, people, when they thought about barbecue, they thought about African Americans making that. So fast forward, until you get to the late 80s, it's hard to even do any writing about barbecue and not mention African Americans. In fact, people would think that was really weird. This all changes in the early 90s when we get the emergence of mass media with food, for instance, the Food Network, pre-existing publications like Gourmet and Bon Appetit. They may have had a grilling episode every June just to announce but for fine dining chefs and others, grilling was not a big deal. So as the 90s progress, there starts to be a lot of interest in American food traditions in general, but barbecue is one of them. And so millions of people start getting introduced to barbecue, and they have two questions. What is barbecue, and where do I get the good stuff? And unfortunately, the people that were in charge of storytelling about barbecue at that time, rather than presenting this really diverse picture of barbecue, contributions, specialties, all that kind of stuff, we just get white dudes.
So kind of zooming out a little bit, what is the, outside of like capturing history and the contribution of the people in history that have had a significant influence on food in America and the world, what else would you like for people to take away from this? Is it for them to like almost pay respect and homage and sort of just have like that sort of appreciation of like, oh, this is where this came from, and sort of acknowledge the contribution, or is there a bit more than that?
Well, I just want people to just ask the question, where does this come from? And then be curious to kind of see all of the constituent parts and how they make a whole. And so that's what I love to see. I would love to see people just acknowledge contribution.
What advice would you give to someone interested in exploring the intersection of food, culture, and history, and how they begin to uncover the stories that have shaped their own culinary heritage?
Think about the cuisine you want to explore, and just go to your local library and ask a reference librarian. And just say, hey, this is what I'm thinking about. Can you help me? Because reference librarians have been very helpful for me. Because believe it or not, a lot of times they're really bored because people don't ask them questions.
And they're underappreciated.
And they're very underappreciated. And they love weird questions. And then they can point you to resources in the library. And then it's a matter of self-education. So that's one route. Another is there's almost a video on everything on YouTube or online. So I would start reading, watching those. Now, here's the thing. There's a lot of misinformation online. So you really have to consult various sources just to see, okay, what's the real story here? Because it's just a lot of fake lore, as the guy named Andrew Smith coined that term, and it's so perfect. There's just a lot of misinformation about food. And the reason why there is because food is for a long time been taken for granted. And so nobody took the time to seriously document, because it wasn't something that you thought of as a discipline, right? It was just like, we got to eat.
Okay, my final question before we get to the quickfire round, which is a quickfire round, is living bountifully through food. So how can food be a source of abundance, not just nutritionally, but emotionally and spiritually when it comes to living a bountiful life?
I just think it's about connection. I just think the more that we understand what food means in our culture, when we understand our food system, the rituals that we have around food, why we come together. And, if we're just, like me, a curious person with an appetite, I think that it's just a way for us to really just connect. What I have found is that people are more open to come together around eating than they may be in other settings. And when you sit down at a table, it creates an environment where you're just more open to talk and learn. more so than other things. And so I just think food is a powerful way to connect.
I think that's really good. Okay, quick fire round. What, in your opinion, is the most underrated fruit or vegetable?
Underrated? In the U.S.? Okay, I would say okra in the U.S. and not around the world.
I actually want to grow it this year in my garden.
Nice. This comes from a person who used to hate okra, but now I love it.
Okay. What is your favorite cocktail?
Oh, I love just a rum and Coke. Cuba Libre with some lime.
Yep. Worst meal that your parents made you eat?
It was something rice-based because I never liked white rice. And so it had to be something with a lot of rice in it.
Rice is proving to be a controversial childhood food. What word describes your life?
Joyful.
What are you most proud of?
The fact that I actually wrote a book on soul food, just actually, instead of talking, just actually did it.
Do you have any principles that you live by?
Faith-based. So mine is just what Jesus taught us to do is to love each other. And one of my sadness is I know this is quick fire and I'm giving a long answer.
Okay.
One source of sadness is how just the teachings of Jesus have been manipulated to be divisive and hateful, because he was about peace and love, and that's what I'm about.
What's one thing that has really mattered in life more than you maybe appreciated at the time?
Leisure. Because I'm a workaholic, and I get a hold of something and I'm just researching it to death or whatever. But I think there is tremendous value to just taking some time to, have fun and just get balance.
Thank you, Adrian, for sharing your journey, your experience, some of your spirit, I guess, with the Bountifull Podcast, and for our audiences listening to this all around the world. For our listeners eager to view more of Adrian's work, we'll include all of the links in the show notes. And go buy his books. I bought all three, and I've been working my way through them. They are excellent, and I think they have many nuggets of wisdom, so I'm all the wiser for that. And if today's episode resonated or inspired you, please subscribe, follow, send it to your mom, send it to your friends, and keep listening to the season. It's filled with extraordinary guests from diverse backgrounds, all contributing to our exploration of what it means to live a bountiful life. So thank you, Adrian, for giving me this time, and I've kept you way too long, but that's okay. And thank you for tuning in as well. Thank you. Bye.
Peace.